So good day. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm at the Hannah Arendt Center, and welcome to the newest session of our virtual reading group. This is very exciting today. We're going to start reading through Hannah Arendt's book, Between Past and Future. This is one of my favorite books of Hannah Arendt's, and I guess I could say that about a lot of her books, so it might not be surprising. But this book is unique in that it's a series of essays. It's not a book that is a traditional book like The Human Condition or On Revolution. And yet these essays were published in all over the place, in the New Yorker, in the New York Review of Books, and other journals, both academic and popular. And yet they are, in my mind, some of the most thoughtful, provocative, and important essays she wrote. What's more, she collected these essays. There's only 2 books of essays that she published that she collected. Actually 3. Men in Dark Times, Crisis of the Republic, and this. And these essays are really designed, in her mind, as a collective project. They're a project, as she says at the end of this preface that we're going to read today, that are exercises. They're exercises in how to think, and specifically in political thought. And the point is that this book has an overriding theme, which is how to think in politics, how to think about politics. And we can even say a little bit more specifically, it's about how to think in and about politics today in the modern world, which specifically is a world in which the chain of tradition has been broken, in which, to use the metaphor with which she opens the essay, the treasure of our inheritance, the tradition that gives us meaning and in a sense papers over the gaps and allows us to understand and think about our place in the world in a meaningful way, has been broken and been lost. She thinks this happened in the midst of the 20th century, and that we are, for the first time in a long time, certainly since the rise of Rome, thrust back into a position in which not just the great thinkers and the great artists need to think about politics in this free way in which he calls the gap between present and future, past and future, but that to a much greater degree and to an extent unheard of in the history of the West since Rome, almost everybody has to think in this way. And the problem, she believes, is that we have lost the habit of such thinking. We're out of practice. And we need to somehow get back into practice of thinking about politics. And these essays in this book are designed to, in a sense, reacquaint us with the habit and practice of thinking. To me, this is probably the most important task of our time and her writing. And I love these essays because, especially as we get closer to the end of the book, they're about topics that many of us think and care about still today, whether it's education or technology, or freedom or authority. And yet they are attempts to not just say something about those ideas, but to learn how to think within connection to them. So that's the overarching understanding of what this book does. And this preface is an attempt to describe what it means to think. And she does so through a metaphor. This is something she wrote a lot about in her life. There are other books in which she explores this. Most directly, the first book of the unfinished book, Life of the Mind, is called Thinking. And in fact, the last chapter of that section in thinking is called The Gap Between Past and Future, and is an extended version of the discussion of the Kafka parable that you see at the end of this preface. So these are questions that she comes back to throughout her life. I hope you had a chance to read it and to look at the video that I sent out. I know some people already asked questions on the Google documents, and I've answered some of them already, but I'm happy to go into them again. Let me pick one or two out that might be I think important for us. One is, and this is asked by Bob Meyerson, is she deploring or celebrating the loss of tradition? And he writes, I think she sees it as both an opportunity and a threat. And that, I think, is exactly right. She does see it as an opportunity and as a threat. And it's important for us to understand both. It's a threat insofar as what tradition does is it gives us, it places us in the world. Traditio is to carry over. And in German, we say Übertragung. It's a carrying over from the past. And what is carried over from the past is a kind of world that places us and, in a sense, tells us how we should understand politics, and thus, for most of us, prevents us from having to think about it anew. We talk a lot about prejudices in our time. You know, we all have prejudices. Prejudices are prejudgments. And for Arendt, there are good and bad prejudices. We couldn't live without prejudices. Prejudices are just those unthought traditions that structure our world. And if we had to think about every single one of them all the time, we would go crazy. We would never have time to live. The work of politics, though, is to challenge prejudices that are problematic and unjust. And she takes that very seriously. But when tradition is strong, when the treasure of the past is meaningful, we don't have to spend much time in politics and political thinking challenging those prejudices and those traditions. When that ends, when tradition is broken, well, then we need to constantly rethink, what does it mean to be a democracy? What does it mean for women to vote or not to vote, or to have rights? Or how do we think about sexual abuse or sexual relations? Or how do we think about racism? And suddenly these questions occupy us on a day-to-day basis. And we have to think about them. And from Arendt's perspective, like I said, we have somewhat lost our practice. So it's a challenge, but it's also an opportunity, because it gives us the opportunity to, once again, freely and thoughtfully think about our world, and it gives us the opportunity to re-engage and even recreate that world in a way that is more to our liking. It's dangerous, and yet it's also exhilarating. And I think that's a big part of what she's trying to do. I don't know if Bob is on the call today, but if he or anyone else wants to respond or think about that or anything else.
I am on, but I think you put it very well. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. Bob, were there other questions that you would ask that you'd like me to talk about? You asked a bunch. I tried to respond to them all in the Google Doc. Was there one that you wanted to carry on further?
Well, I was quibbling with her use of the idea of revolution, because she was thinking in terms of revolutions, you might say, from the left and not from the right. But of course, I think she was doing that because for her, a real revolution, or what qualifies as a revolution, is that it establishes a realm of freedom, whereas the revolutions from the right, of course, don't.
That's right, and somewhat this is a technical point, and yet I think it's always with her more than technical. Uh, Arendt makes a distinction between liberation and revolution. This is in her book on revolution. So a liberation is a freeing oneself from an oppressor or a tyranny. So when, to use a recent example, when the Egyptians freed themselves by overthrowing the government by protesting in Tahrir Square, she would call that not a revolution, but a liberation. A revolution for Hannah Arendt takes time and only happens when freedom is founded, when the liberation doesn't lead to the return of oppression through a new government, but actually a world of freedom emerges. And so for her, revolution, which is not just a liberation and not just a violent act, but is a revolving, a return back to basic freedoms emerges. And what she argues is that when people see themselves as revolutionary, what they really want is not simply liberation, but freedom. And that most revolutions fail to establish freedom, but that's what we should and to think about revolutions and to make better revolutionaries, we need to think about what revolution is. And in many ways, the book on revolution is an extended essay in political thought and exercise in thinking about what a revolution is, and in doing so, criticizing the French Revolution for its misunderstanding of revolutionary freedom, and holding up the example of the American Revolution as an example of a revolution that better understood what it means to be free. That was then later corrupted because of a couple of mistakes they made, in her view. But these are attempts to think about the idea of revolution, and thus the book on revolution could be an expanded sense of an expanded idea of one of these essays in the book, Between Past and Future. I know Howard had asked a question about what is freedom and the relation between freedom and anarchy, because he said on page 3, she writes that without the paraphernalia of officialdom and hidden from the eyes of friend and foe, all relevant business in the affairs of the country was transacted in deed and word. And the question is, does this represent an idea of anarchy? Again, not an easy question to answer. On one level, Hannah Arendt is not an anarchist. She believes deeply in government and in political authority, and in the institutions that regulate and govern politics. On the other hand, she is a fundamental anarchist. She doesn't believe in sovereignty, or she doesn't believe that sovereignty should be sought. In fact, she has a very famous line that to me is one of the keys of her political thinking in the book on revolution, in which she says that the fundamental insight of the American founders and of the American Revolution was the insight that sovereignty and tyranny are the same. And so for her, the effort is to create a political world in which we can exist without a sovereign authority, without a single idea, a single person or institution that is in charge. So that might seem like a kind of anarchist thought. She also believes deeply that the power in society should be multiplied into as many different institutions and sources as possible. Again, that could be seen as anarchic. If anarchic is understood as without an order, anarche, without a center. But in the end, she believes deeply that what you need are multiple orders, multiple power sources. And you don't want simply everyone doing their own thing. You want a conflict of plural power orders and power centers. And that's very much her idea. So there's an anarchic element to it, but in the end, I don't think it's anarchy. Okay, so those are sort of some of the questions that were asked ahead of time on the Google document, and I'm always happy to respond to those. I'm happy to talk more, but I'd love to hear what you guys found interesting, problematic, challenging.
Roger, this is Jack.
Yes.
Jack Hirschfeld. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I have a question. It's just a minor question, but at the beginning, she gives this quote from Rene Char, and then during the discussion in the first couple of pages, she has a number of quotes, but she doesn't identify the sources. So are those all out of Char? For example, I'll just give you an example. For example, the quote. Let's see, I had one here just a minute ago. The one about sitting at the freedom at the table.
Yes,
you know which one I mean?
These are all from a book of poetry that poetry and essays that Char publishes after the war.
So when she says action that has a meaning for the living has value only for the dead, completion only in the minds that inherit and question it, that's from Char.
I believe so. I would have to go back and check every quote, but I know that most of what she's citing here is from Char, and
Okay.
Certainly the idea of the table is, and
it just wasn't clear. It wasn't clear. That's so. Thank you. That's very helpful.
Yeah. I mean, Char is someone who was a poet and really had seen, as many poets and artists do, and Arendt thinks almost necessarily so, had seen the public world as a world to be avoided, in the sense that for her, poetry and art and the creation of poetry and art has to take place in private, separate from the social and political world, because what a poet and artist does is reify or thingify in a form a thought that is new and original, and does it in a way that thought is new and original and surprising, and yet in some way seductive enough or beautiful or shining enough that people pay attention to it. And that if a poet is going to create something new and spontaneous and different, they have to be somewhat separate from society. They can't just be parodying what everybody else is saying. And so she finds that she thinks that artists and thinkers have to in some way separate themselves from the world. It's not that is part of, I think, the challenge and the thought in this essay, to try and understand what she means by this gap, this space between past and future, which she does see as the space of thought. And one of the things she says, and I mentioned it earlier, is that for most of history, from the Roman period till now, the only occupants of that space, or the people who were at home in that space, were, she says, the thinkers and the artists. They were the ones who moved beyond the everyday, the normal time flow of past flowing into future, and in a sense sought to jump out of that battleground of the two forces, either into this space of the umpire, the Hegelian umpire. But she finds more exciting than that metaphor, and this is where she says that she is somewhat moving away from Kafka, not jumping out of time, but jumping, as she says it, into the world. So, and this goes to a question Bob had asked. For Hegel, the jump is a jump out, above. It's what she would call metaphysics, in the sense that we jump above the fray and look down from it with a universalist viewpoint. But that universalist viewpoint is one that really can only happen within a world of tradition, within a world of metaphysics. Um, and so for Hegel, the spectator, the he in the Kafka story, or the Hegelian spectator, looks down at the battle from a sort of objective, universal point of view, what is called by Hegel objective Geist. Kant, for Arendt, has a different view, which is that the space of thinking is not a universal, but is free. And it's one in which the thinker, man, creates a new idea, a new story in watching and then telling the story of the battle. One that is not outside of human time, but actually influences and impacts human time. And that's why she describes this as a parallelogram of forces. And I didn't put a drawing of this in your book, in the video, but it is something worth considering in its, and I'll show you a picture of it here. She draws it in the book, The Life of the Mind. And what she means by the parallelogram of forces is that you have the past and the future as two straight lines intersecting at the middle. And what interests her is that diagonal line, which she calls a third force. And it's that third force that is the vector that has an origin, and that origin is human thinking, human spontaneity. And we don't know where it's going to go, but it inserts a new force into the world. And for her, that's what an artist or thinker has done throughout history, is think something, make something, do something that inserts a real new force in the world and changes the course of the world. And that's very much what she imagines thinking, real thinking, political thinking to be. And for her, to a large extent, that must be done in private, which is why we all need privacy. We all need a sphere in which we are separate from the world, where we can think and grow independently so that we can act as thoughtful human beings, which is why she's so concerned about the loss of privacy and the growth of the social sphere, something we've talked about in other discussions. Other questions, thoughts?
This is Bob Meyerson again, and I'm looking at page 9, where she talks about if one were to write the intellectual history of our century, etc., one would have to turn full circle not once but twice. First, when he escaped from thought into action, I take that to mean to reference the French existentialists and maybe some others, Pareto, I don't know. And then again, when action, or rather having acted, forced him back into thought. Who did she have in mind there, herself?
That's a good question. I think she had in mind Kafka, particularly in that instance, or people like Kafka. Kafka was someone who retreated from the world and saw thought and the activity of thinking as some of the most vibrant activities one could engage in. Another person that she thought about in that way was Martin Heidegger. And she has a critique of Heidegger along those lines, which is that his thought was so active that it was unworldly and thus outside of the world and outside of politics. But I think those are the kinds of people she's thinking about, people for whom thinking becomes a real a world unto itself, which is dangerous insofar as it forgets the political and the real world that we live in. And I think she would think of herself in neither of those categories, Bob. If I had to put it in my own attempts to understand it, she sees herself as someone who wants to exist both in the world of action and in the world of thinking. She wants her thinking to not be abstracted, to not be pure thought, but to be about and engaged in the world as an exercise of politics. That's my attempt there. I mean, this is a section that I don't think is immediately obvious. It's a good question, but that's how I've understood it. Other questions? Comments?
Roger?
Yep.
Roger, I'd like to add to that. She's talking here about thinking about the intellectual history of the century through the biography of single persons. And she might, I don't know specifically who she has in mind. Obviously, it's not clear specifically who she has in mind, but she could be thinking about Sartre. She could be thinking about Camus. She could be thinking about Bertrand Russell, for that matter. People all of whom went through this cycle of going into action and then back into thought based on that action. So people don't usually think of Russell that way, but I say, all of his activism around nuclear disarmament, which is often forgotten, was very important. And so I think that there's a number of people. She's talking about the biography of a single person. What I felt when reading this was that sense that the century itself had external events that brought people who were essentially thinkers out into the world of action, and then because they were essentially thinkers, were able to reflect on that action in order to advance their own thought. And that's the way I read that section.
Yeah. Thanks, Jack. I'm going to resist that a little bit, but with saying I'm not sure I fully have a full sense of what she has in mind here. I think when she talks about the first step, the retreat from thought into action, she does have in mind people like Sartre and Camus, and as she says, the French existentialists, who think that the failure of thought, the failure of metaphysical thoughts, has led to a situation in which meaning is not to be found through thought, but only through action. And she's quite critical of that move. She understands it, I think, but she's critical of it insofar as she sees it in a kind of she sees in Sartre a kind of things that existentialism as a humanism, that we privilege existence over thought, and she worries that that's a dangerous move. For Russell, I don't think she thought much of Russell in any way, but the bigger point that you're making with Russell is, what do we make about the engaged academic or the engaged intellectual, the one who leaves the study and goes and protests? And again, I don't think that's what she means. That's not, she thinks that that's important for citizens, whether they be bricklayers or philosophers, to have a political life. but she's not saying that here. When she says forced back to thought, I think she's really thinking about people who think when you turn to action, you end up with a kind of a loss and a kind of existentialism that is without something essential. And then people like Kafka and Heidegger find in thinking a kind of pure action, which again is an appeal to thought, and that it makes us aware of different kind of thinking in this way. So I don't know. I think that these are it's a complicated sentence that we've turned to, and it's important, but it's not just about we as academics should enter politics. I just want to be very clear about that.
Got it.
There's a question here: is the distinction between outside human time and emerging diagonally from human time why she says Kafka so rightly calls the protagonist he rather than somebody? Why does he call it he? I don't. The point is, she wants it to be a concrete, not just a. It's not a somebody. It's this person, and what pronoun are we going to use? I mean, this comes to a difficult question for many people, in not only Arendt but many writers. She insists that the he is both a specific pronoun and yet a non-gendered pronoun, which is what it is in German and English. It has that double meaning, and there are, of course, many critics who would argue that to use he in the universal sense, in the general sense of non-gendered, is problematic. And there's certainly good arguments that it is. But what she says is that he is the word that we have in German and English for a specific pronomial word that is without a gender. And that's why she insists throughout on using the word he, and not a they or some other pronoun, because she doesn't want it to become an abstraction. There's another question. Doesn't she qualify thinking as one form of action in the human condition? Yes, she does. And that's what she does here as well. So, I mean, the key sentence in my reading of this whole text, this preface, is on page 11 to 12, where she's talking about this diagonal force on the bottom of 11. And she says the diagonal force, on the contrary, would be limited as to its origin. That means it begins with a he, with a person. Its starting point being the clash of the antagonistic forces that meet at this he, but it would be infinite with respect to its ending by virtue of having resulted from the concerted action of two forces whose origin is infinity. At this clash, the third force comes out, and as the two forces keep hitting, that force keeps going. It never stops. This diagonal force, whose origin is known, whose direction is determined by past and future, but whose eventual end lies in infinity, is the perfect metaphor for the activity of thought. Thought is an activity. It's something one does in this gap that is exerted, that is active. But it's not an activity that is simply action without thought, in a way that Sartre might imagine it. And it's not an activity that is, in thinking, retreating from the world. It's an activity that, in its being outside of the everyday ideas of time, and thus outside of our everyday experience of the world, is in and engaged in the world. That's the really hard part to understand and to think about. It's a thinking that is both outside of the everyday, and thus in this timeless, spaceless realm that she talks about. And yet it's a thinking that is part of a battle, a struggle that is impacting and engaged in the world every day. And so one thing I can add here, and this comes back to the Hegel and Kant distinction I made earlier, is that Arendt says we have really two choices in how to think about this space of thought, this spectator who's looking at the world. And she says, one, we can say with Hegel that Weltgeschichte ist das Weltgericht, is die Weltgericht, which means that the history of the world is the tribunal of the world. That means that what is true is what has happened. And that when we look at it from this he who jumps out of time, we basically are looking at it from this distance, and we see what the truth of the world is by what's happened. And she says, or we can stand with Kant and say that what we see when we jump out of these forces into this gap is the autonomy of man to judge and to begin anew and to start something new. And it's this jumping out, but in a sense, by jumping out, jumping back in through a judgment in which we start something new, that Arendt understands the activity of thinking. And if we put that in the context of the essays we're going to read, in each of these essays, we're going to try and jump out. We're going to remove ourselves from the common sense, the way these issues are being treated by others. We're going to try and free ourselves from the debates and the controversies, and look at them from a external, outside, free point of view. And yet we're going to jump back in, and in thinking about these and struggling with them in public, we're going to try and create a vector, a new idea that will move us and move the world. So there's another question here. She talks about people being confronted with uncharted action territory, a lack of tradition, who must strike a, quote, what now kind of moment. And I was put in mind of historical moments like Yalta. Yalta could be one. I think there are numerous. And I think that you're right. She is talking about moments in which something like this happens. What she's saying more than that, though, is that we're now in a position in which we have one of these moments almost all the time. Now, we can't think like this all the time. Like I said before, to do so would be paralyzing. If we every minute of the day confronted our prejudices. But we are now at a moment in which whatever common sense we might embrace and believe to be right, when we step back from that and look at it from perspectives of others around us, we see it as problematic. We see it as limited, as perspectival. There's very few things. I mean, if you think about the things that most ages and most cultures have taken for granted, their own God, we don't live at a time in which, not only in which we can assume that our God is the God, but we don't live at a time in which we can assume that there is a God in most places we live. If you want to, an idea that, I don't know, a family should be a certain way. These now are open questions. There's almost nothing how we should raise children, right? There's almost no common sense answer we can give that doesn't lead to a real meaningful debate if we open ourselves to that debate. And so what she's actually saying is we live at a time in which on almost all the questions of how we should live, we don't have the comfort of appealing to tradition unless we're willing to deny the right of other people's ideas and traditions. And that's a very dangerous time that we live in. And it's going to require us learning how to think these things through, and that's what she's trying to model for us. So I have another question. This is from Suzanne Ouellette. In this new space for thinking in the gap that Arendt calls us to, might Arendt allow for the finding of some of the lost treasure she describes in the opening, a finding of oneself, a joining with others to create a space of public freedom? Or is this too romantic a reading? So I think the answer to that is yes and no. Insofar as Arendt sees herself as someone who's given up on the metaphysical project of finding a truth, that doesn't mean we give up on the project of looking and talking, but when we look and talk, what we are confronted with is fragments, not a coherent story. And when we're confronted with these fragments, there are a couple of seductive paths, right? One is to say they're all fragments, so there's no story, so we should just live. In many ways, that's what she thinks the existentialists do, or there are worse approaches where you just anything goes in a way. The anarchists. Another is to try and take those fragments and do what Suzanne here is saying, which is weave them into a new story. And so here's where I think it's complicated. I think Arendt does want us to try and weave these fragments of the history into a new story. But we have to do so in full recognition of the fact that the story we're weaving is a story. And the attempt to make it into a new controlling story is an attempt. It runs the danger of something along the lines of totalitarianism, tyranny, a new story that we have to force others to accept. If a new story emerges that gets overwhelming acceptance, it becomes a new tradition in many ways. And yet, and so I think Arendt has a mixed feeling about that, which is, on the one hand, we need such things. We can't live without structuring stories, without what she calls at the end of one of the essays in this book, the essay on truth and politics, the ground on which we walk and the sky above us. We need stories. We need some firm facts and firm beliefs. We can't go through life without any common public world to hold on to. We would just drown in a way. We would fall. And yet, she's going to insist that each one of these stories, these truths, these things that we take as absolutely fundamental, is now in a post-metaphysical age to be seen as contingent and open to retelling, and that's the hard part in that kind of a question. Does anyone want to respond? I mean, I've been talking a lot.
Hi, I have some. This is Cynthia in Kansas City. I do a lot of. I write a lot of National Register nomination documents, and and this is really. I've thought about this for the last couple of years and how having the guidelines of how we define what is historically significant in communities. It follows this Arendtian not methodology per se, but you take the fragments, whatever you dig up in your research. For me, it's often looking through newspapers, letters, whatever it is that I have to piece together, and I have to develop why that building or that site or that public space is significant for this narrow period. Literally, we call it a period of significance. And so it's like you have to take what the context was at that moment while also considering where you are now, because it has to be tied to the locality, the public, the state, whatever level of significance it has. So this is more practical on a day. For me, this is practical every day. This is I'm living and breathing this. But I mean, not every architectural or public historian comes at it this way. But because not everyone's reading Hannah Arendt while they're talking about a Louis Sullivan building or something. But yeah, this is like it's what we do, and it's more around us than we think. It's that specific minutia of the significance, and for me, defining that significance.
Thank you, Cynthia. That's a really helpful and thoughtful comment. These questions have come up in a huge way in the last 50 years, and in the last year, I'm sure some of you know that on college campuses there have been enormous debates about renaming buildings and that were named for people during the slave period and
Right.
and things of this sort. And that is the question, that Cynthia, I think, is bringing up, which is, how do you decide what stories, what public stories we want to enshrine in our monuments and in our memory as a nation? And one step of that is, in the present, what do we want to currently give historical significance to? And then in 50 years, do we want to revisit those decisions, right? I mean, are we the kind of people that want to, in a sense, 50 years on, cleanse the history that is now seen as problematic? And these are important questions. In thinking about it through this book, the question is, to what extent, and this is the question that Suzanne was asking as well, to what extent we want to try and hold on to and constitute a tradition. And in many ways, what I take Arendt to be arguing throughout this book is that we constantly want to be thinking about and creating traditions. But we can't. We have to accept the fact that we live at a time in which tradition is broken, which means that the act of creating or preserving a tradition is always a political one. It's not natural.
Right.
And for that reason, to simply say we can't talk about this because it's the way it is isn't going to work. We have to be willing to argue about it and talk about it and think about it. And it may be that in arguing about it, we say we want to keep buildings named after Calhoun for this reason or that reason. Or we may say we don't want to keep buildings named after Calhoun for this reason or that reason. But to appeal simply to tradition is to ignore the fact that tradition is not an answer today. That's her argument. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't be trying to build common stories that in some ways unite us and around a world that we share, because to her, that's what politics is. It's building common stories that unite us around a world we share in spite of our differences. That is the activity of politics. We're now at a position where you can't do politics in many ways without thinking, by which she means stepping out of politics and then thinking in a way that reinserts us back into politics.
Roger, I think she also talks about the real difficulty, or rather the difficulty in the real world of doing what you just said, doing this ideal redevelopment of tradition, because in real time, the past continually grows and the future continually disappears. In real time, we are in the current moment, where the next moment, the future moment, becomes the past, and the future is changed. And each person steps into that every minute, all the time. We're in the break, or the gap between past and future, is non-experiential. It's only theoretical. And to enter into that gap is therefore quite difficult, because our experience is one of a continual linear passage of time in which the future is continually becoming the past, and where my past today is very different than the past of somebody just being born, or just being or somebody much younger. I have a piece of past in my life that's not part of other people's lives, and then of course there's the individuation as well. So this is all aspects of real existence that create, I don't want to say an obstacle, but because she doesn't think it's really an obstacle, but create the difficulty of stepping out of that time regimen to think clearly.
I think that's well said, Jack. One thing I can add, maybe, is that in The Life of the Mind, where she talks about this a little bit more, she talks about how this gap, this space, this time space that we're talking about, is like a land of meaning. It's not a land of truth. It's a land of meaning. That she says, and I'm quoting, this is page 211 in The Life of the Mind, which you don't have, so just bear with me, where what remains ungraspable for mortal man can manifest itself in the sheer continuity of the I am. Mm-hmm. So that in some way the gap that we're talking about here, this between past and future, is where we approach the ungraspable, what we as humans in our mortal lives can't really understand. And we can make it manifest, and we make it manifest in the I am, in this presence where we act and we think, and in some way, by on the one hand stepping out and touching this not land of truth, but land of meaning, and yet also thinking about the world, we somehow bring a kind of ineffable, grasping thinking to our worldly actions. And it's that struggle which she's here, which is hard, as you're rightly putting, in fact, very hard, which she's talking about.
Hi, Roger, can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
Just the territory we're striking out on presently, would you think that this is the distinction Arendt is trying to make when she attempts a distinction between tradition and inheritance? That traditions are almost like Cynthia was saying, these edifices that get solidified in the ground of the past, and that perhaps we want to honor just as past traditions, not necessarily as truths, but this ability to think out of that segment between past and future into something that's new, maybe ineffable, as you put it, is our human inheritance. That's it.
In what ways are tradition inherited, right? I mean, what is an inheritance? It's what you come into. You're born into it in some way, and I think the distinction you're making, John, is if I understand it, is good. It's that we are born into a world, and there are traditions in this world. Let's be clear, right? We all know them, but our tradition, and the word that you didn't, I don't think you used, and it's important, is not given to us or left to us by a testament. It's not set for us. It's not settled. And that's the break. So it's not that we live in a world without traditions. We have lots of them. It's that there's no definite set testamentary tradition, if you want to expand the metaphor, or if I'm doing it correctly. Which means that we now live at a time in which we have to negotiate these traditions, and that's what the challenge and opportunity of our moment is. I'm not sure if I answered your question, John, but maybe I missed it.
I'm not sure that I was that clear, but you did touch on it. And the point is that because these things, an inheritance is left by last will and testament, yeah. And as I'm suggesting that her idea of an inheritance as opposed to a tradition is that we inherit this, that we all are part and parcel with, that as we're inserted into this plane of time, a certain ineffability, the ability to think and to create and to perform ourselves. And that's our inheritance on the basis of simply who we are, not a testament.
Okay, so that's a slightly different question. I get it now. In that sense, our inheritance is to be the kind of people who can think and act in the ways that she's talking about. And that's important. To her, that is not something, and here go back to those of you who've been reading with us for a while and read The Human Condition. She doesn't think that comes from our human nature. It comes from our human condition. And what that means is it's quite possible that we could lose that capacity to think and act, which is part of our tradition and our inheritance. The greatest danger to that aspect of the human inheritance, as she talks about both in The Human Condition and in the final essay in this book, the essay on the conquest of space, is the scientific demand and desire to make man automatically predictable according to algorithms and calculations. And that would, in the end thinking, and thus end the human condition, which has been a condition that has, for greater or lesser extents, been impacted by thinking for thousands of years. And that is a worry she has. And the book will end, right, with the final essay, which is the essay that was written last and added to the last edition of this book, about the dangers to the possibility of human thinking from technology and science. And that is how the book will end. And so when we get there, let's hope, John, that we can remember that question. Maybe you can bring it up again. Is there one last question, or should we get ready for our next meeting? Well, I see. Let me just say that the next two essays, Tradition in the Modern Age, and then especially the concept of history, are it's not that they're the most difficult, although they're the most philosophical. There's a lot of history of philosophy in the next two essays. And so I will, in the videos, do my best to give you the background for that. But they're going to be a little harder, I think, for many of us who aren't trained in this background than some of the other essays in the book. And so if you're having trouble, don't worry. Look at the video, and then we can talk about it next month. I see there's one last question from Bob. Watching the World Series, my wife asked, why not eliminate the umpires and just have computers call the balls and strikes? I want umpires even when they are wrong. I think that is an essentially human response and deeply Arendtian. So we'll leave it at that. Thank you all very much. I wish you another month of enjoying reading Hannah Arendt, and we'll meet next Friday. Thanks very much.